I always thought we were a normal family. My parents, David and Linda, were the perfect couple. At least that's what I believed growing up. My younger brother, Ethan, was the golden child, always praised for his intelligence and charm. While I, Ryan, was the rebellious one. I never resented Ethan for it. He was my brother, my best friend, and the person I trusted the most. Everything changed the day Ethan decided to take a DNA test. It started as a joke. He got one of those ancestry kits for his birthday from a friend, and we laughed about it. "Imagine if it turns out we're royalty," Ethan joked as he spat into the test tube. None of us thought much of it. It was supposed to be a fun little experiment. A few weeks later, the results arrived. Ethan's face was pale when he checked them. I was sitting beside him, scrolling through my phone, when he suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Ryan, something's wrong," he muttered. I leaned over and stared at the screen. His ancestry was completely different from mine. We were supposed to have the same parents, the same DNA, yet his test results said otherwise. My heart pounded. "There has to be a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. Ethan was silent, staring at the screen as if he could will the results to change. A terrible thought crept into my mind, one that I didn't want to consider. My parents had always been loving, but there were moments, unexplained tensions, hushed conversations when they thought we weren't listening. Could it be possible that Ethan wasn't really my full brother? I grabbed my phone and ordered a DNA test for myself. I needed answers. For the next few days, Ethan and I barely spoke. He was withdrawn, lost in thought, while I tried to act like everything was normal. But inside, I was terrified. If Ethan wasn't my real brother, what did that mean for our family? When my test results finally came back, the truth shattered everything I had ever believed. The moment my DNA results arrived, my hands trembled as I opened the email. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. I scanned through the details, looking for the answer that could either set my mind at ease or destroy everything. And then I saw it. Ethan and I weren't full brothers. In fact, we weren't even half brothers. I felt my breath hitch. That wasn't possible. We had the same parents. We had grown up in the same house. We shared childhood memories, fights, laughter, and secrets. But according to science, we were strangers. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, my body frozen in place. Then, without thinking, I rushed downstairs where Ethan was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. He looked up the moment I entered, his expression unreadable. "What did it say?" His voice was hoarse. I didn't speak. I just handed him my phone. He took it, his eyes scanning the results, and I saw the exact moment he understood. His grip on the phone tightened, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. "We don't share the same parents, Ethan," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of that sentence pressed down on both of us. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Then, "Who the hell am I?" We both knew what had to be done. There was only one way to get answers. That night, when our parents came home, I was waiting for them. Ethan sat beside me, silent, his face pale. My father placed his keys on the counter, my mother took off her coat, and for a brief moment, everything looked normal. But we were about to shatter that illusion. "We need to talk," I said, my voice colder than I intended. My parents exchanged glances. My mother frowned. "About what?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "About why my DNA doesn't match Ryan's. About why I don't belong in this family." The blood drained from my mother's face. My father's expression hardened, his hands clenching into fists. The silence stretched between us, suffocating, unbearable. And then, my mother did something I never expected. She broke down in tears. My father, however, remained stone-faced. "Where did you take this test?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That's all you have to say?" My father exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead, and then he finally said the words that changed everything. "Because you were never supposed to find out." Ethan stiffened beside me, his fingers curling into fists. My own breath caught in my throat. The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. I glanced at my mother, expecting her to say something, to deny it, to tell us it was all a mistake. But she just sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face. Ethan took a step forward, his voice trembling with rage. "What the hell does that mean? I was never supposed to find out?" My father's jaw tightened. He looked at my mother, then back at us. "This isn't how we wanted to tell you." I felt something snap inside me. "So it's true?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. "Ethan isn't my brother?" My mother finally lifted her tear-streaked face. "No," she whispered, "not by blood." The ground beneath me seemed to shift. I turned to Ethan, but he was staring at my parents, his whole body trembling. "Then whose son am I?" His voice cracked on the last word. A long silence followed. My mother kept looking at my father as if pleading with him to say something, but it was my father who finally exhaled and spoke. "You were adopted." Ethan staggered back, as if the words had physically struck him. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. "No, that's not true. You're lying." "We're not," my mother said, her voice filled with anguish. "We never wanted you to feel different, so we never told you. We loved you as our own. We still do." I could see the raw pain in Ethan's eyes, the betrayal cutting him deeper than anything else ever had. His whole life, his identity, had been a lie. "Who are my real parents?" His voice was barely above a whisper. My father hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. We don't know." That answer sent a fresh wave of pain crashing over Ethan. He shook his head, backing away. "You mean to tell me I've been living a lie my whole life, and you don't even know where I come from?" My mother's sobs turned into choked gasps. "We only know what we were told when we took you in." Ethan's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "Tell me everything," he demanded. "Right now." My father let out a heavy sigh, as if he had been carrying this burden for years. "You were abandoned as a baby, left outside a church, wrapped in a blanket, no note, nothing. The authorities couldn't find your parents. After months of searching, they put you up for adoption. And he hesitated. "We took you in." Ethan blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the weight of those words. I could see the way his chest rose and fell erratically, his whole world crumbling before him. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother, my best friend, completely, utterly broken. Then without another word, Ethan turned and walked out the door. I wanted to stop him, but something in his eyes told me he needed to be alone. And for the first time in our lives, I had no idea if he would ever come back. Days passed, but Ethan didn't return. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his friends had no idea where he was. My mother barely ate. My father stayed locked in his office, and the house felt hollow without him. The silence was unbearable. I lay awake at night, staring at my ceiling, replaying that moment over and over, the way his face had crumbled, the way he had walked away. Then one evening my phone rang. My heart lurched when I saw Ethan's name on the screen. I answered immediately. "Ethan?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "I need to know who I am." I swallowed hard. "Where are you?" "I found something." He hesitated as if unsure whether to continue. "I went to the adoption agency." I bolted upright. "And?" "They gave me a file. It doesn't have much, but..." His breath hitched. There was a name. Just one name. My fingers tightened around my phone. "Whose name?" A long pause, then he said, "My mother's." A chill ran through me. He continued, "She never left any contact information, but there's a record of her name on my birth certificate. That's all I have." "What's her name?" I whispered. Another pause. Then finally he spoke. "Margaret Sinclair." My heart stopped. The name sent a jolt through my body, a strange familiarity settling in my chest. I knew that name. "Wait, Margaret Sinclair?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Yes." I felt dizzy. My hands trembled as I tried to process what this meant. "Ethan," I whispered, "that name, that's..." But before I could finish, my father's voice rang through the house. "What's going on?" He stood at my bedroom door, his face pale, his eyes darting between me and my phone. Ethan must have heard him. "Is Dad there?" I hesitated. "Yeah." "Put him on speaker." I did as he asked, my hands clammy. My father frowned but didn't protest. Ethan's voice came through the speaker, steady but ice cold. "Dad, tell me the truth. Do you know who Margaret Sinclair is?" My father's entire body tensed, his face drained of color, and in that moment, I knew. He did know. My father clenched his jaw, then closed his eyes as if bracing for impact. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She's your mother." Silence. A silence so thick, so suffocating, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then Ethan's voice came back, low and broken. "And who is she to you?" My father opened his eyes. They were filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, fear, shame. And then, in a voice that shattered everything, he said, "She was my mistress." The world tilted. I felt like I was going to be sick. Ethan's sharp intake of breath echoed through the phone. Then there was nothing. And then, the call disconnected. I stared at my phone, my father, the walls around me. Everything spinning, everything collapsing. My father had an affair, and Ethan wasn't just my adopted brother. He was my father's son, which meant my brother was actually my half-brother. I barely had time to process the revelation before my mother's scream echoed through the house. She had heard everything, and our family was about to fall apart. My mother's scream shattered the silence like a thunderclap. I turned to see her standing in the hallway, her face twisted in pain, her hands gripping the door frame as if she needed support to keep from collapsing. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the rage simmering beneath her words was unmistakable. "All these years, you lied to me?" My father's face, already pale, turned ghostly white. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised. "Margaret, don't you dare say my name," she snapped, her voice cracking. "How long have you known? How long have you been living this lie?" I could barely breathe. My father looked at me, his expression pleading, as if hoping I would somehow defend him. But I couldn't. I was just as shattered as she was. "Mom," I said weakly. I didn't know either. But she wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes locked onto my father, and in them I saw something terrifying. Years of trust crumbling, love turning into something unrecognizable. "You let me love him like my own son," she choked out. "You let me raise him, believing we had done something good, believing we had given a child a better life." She stopped, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. "And all along, he was yours." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then suddenly she turned to me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Where is he?" I blinked, trying to clear the haze in my mind. I don't know." He hung up. Without another word, she stormed past us, grabbing her car keys from the counter. "Mom, wait!" I rushed after her, but she was already out the door. My father stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw locked. I had never seen him so afraid. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell us?" He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "I never wanted this to come out. I thought it was better this way." "Better?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Better? You lied to all of us. You let Ethan grow up believing he was abandoned, when the truth was, you were his father the entire time?" His face contorted with something between shame and exhaustion. "I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't know how to tell any of you." Anger flared in my chest. "So you just let it fester?" He didn't answer. The silence between us was unbearable. Then suddenly my phone buzzed in my hand. My heart leaped into my throat as I looked at the screen. It was Ethan. I hesitated before answering. "Ethan?" His voice was raw, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Tell Mom not to come looking for me." Panic surged through me. "Ethan, where are you? Just talk to us." "I don't have anything to say." I stepped away from my father, lowering my voice. "Please don't do anything stupid." A bitter chuckle. "Too late for that." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Silence. "Ethan, listen to me. Whatever you're thinking, just come home. We can fix this." His voice cracked. "There is no home for me anymore." And then, the call went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. Something was very, very wrong. And if we didn't find Ethan soon, it might be too late. The icy wind howled as I stood frozen, staring at my phone's dark screen. My breath came in shallow gasps. "Ethan!" I yelled into the void, as if somehow he could still hear me. But the silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's car screeched out of the driveway. She was going after him, and for a second, I considered running after her. But my father's ragged breath behind me pulled my attention back. He looked defeated, more than I had ever seen him before. "We have to find him," he murmured, "before he does something we can't undo." I wanted to scream at him. This was his fault, his lies, his cowardice. It had led us here, but I didn't have time for blame. I dialed Ethan's number again, straight to voicemail. Think, where would he go? And then it hit me, the bridge. When we were kids, whenever Ethan needed space, he always went there. It was his escape, his place to think. But now, with the weight of this revelation crushing him, I was terrified of what he might do. I turned to my father. "We need to go. Now!" His hesitation made me furious. "Dad, if you don't fix this, you'll lose him forever." That lit a fire under him. He grabbed his coat and we ran to the car. The drive felt endless. My mother was already ahead of us, but I prayed we weren't too late. As we approached the bridge, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, standing near the edge, his back to us, staring down at the dark, churning water below. My mother's car was parked on the side of the road, her door flung open. She was already out, slowly approaching him. I jumped out of the car before my father even stopped fully. "Ethan!" I shouted, running toward him. He flinched but didn't turn around. "Stay back," he warned, his voice hoarse. "I don't want to hear anything from any of you." My mother took another careful step. "Ethan, please, just come down from there." "I have nothing left, Mom." His voice cracked, and for the first time, he turned slightly, his eyes red and filled with devastation. Everything I knew about my life was a lie. Tears spilled down my mother's face. "You are not a lie, Ethan. You are my son. Nothing changes that." He let out a shaky breath. "I was never yours to begin with." "You were always mine," she said fiercely. "From the moment I held you in my arms, from the moment I tucked you in at night, you were my son, and I will fight for you, no matter what." My father stepped forward. "Ethan," Ethan clenched his jaw. "You don't get to talk to me. You did this. You lied to me my whole life." My father's face was full of anguish. "I know, and I will never forgive myself for it." He took a deep breath. "But right now, none of that matters. What matters is that you step away from that edge and let us fix this, together." Ethan let out a broken laugh. "You think this can be fixed?" "It can," I said, my voice shaking. "If you let us." He turned back toward the water, and my heart nearly stopped. "Ethan, please," I whispered. "We need you." Silence. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a step back. My mother rushed forward, pulling him into her arms, sobbing. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and my father, for the first time in a long time, let his tears fall freely. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stood there shaking as my mother held on to him like she would never let go. And in that moment, we knew our family would never be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, we could start healing.